He paid her to find his perfect bride. She found 7. But he chose her instead. The ink was still wet on the 7th rejection when Arnold Harry finally looked up. The soft, final scratch of his quill against the vellum sounded like a heavy door closing in the vast, salt-aired library of Ethelgard. For 4 months, Ruth Bennett had stood in this room, clutching her leather portfolio, presenting the most polished women of the Isle of Glass. Each name was a masterpiece of social engineering. Each name was now a black line of failure. "That was the last of them, Your Grace," Ruth said, her voice steady despite the way the Atlantic gales rattled the high library windows. She stood in her sensible wool dress, a sharp contrast to the silk-clad ghosts she had just tried to sell him. Ruth had perfected the art of being a shadow, useful, efficient, and entirely invisible. She expected a dismissal, a final payment, and a return to her father's crumbling cottage in Silver Basin. But the Duke did not reach for his checkbook. He leaned back, his slate-gray eyes tracking the ink stains on Ruth's fingers rather than the names on her list. The air in the room shifted, turning electric and heavy. Ruth realized then that Arnold hadn't been testing the candidates at all. He had been testing the woman who found them. The fire in the great stone hearth did not waver. The Atlantic outside Ethelgard's walls did not quiet. But something in the space between them, between the Duke seated at his mahogany desk and Ruth standing precisely 3 paces from its edge, changed, contracted, became a different kind of silence entirely. Ruth had learned, in 4 months of service to Arnold Harry, the 5th Duke of Ashford, that silence in this library was never empty. It was a living thing. It had weight and texture and intention, the same way the sea outside had moods that the local fishermen of Silver Basin could read before any storm broke the horizon. She had learned to read Arnold's silences the way those fishermen read water, carefully, without sentiment, and always with one eye on the door. But she had not learned to read this. "Your Grace," she said, because someone had to speak and she had long understood that in this house, that someone was always her. "Shall I take the portfolio then? I can begin drafting your correspondence to the families." A letter of polite. No. 1 word. Flat and absolute as a flagstone. Ruth stopped. Arnold set down his quill with the same deliberate care he applied to everything. Not carelessly, not impatiently, but with the precise economy of a man who had never once in his 37 years wasted emotion. He studied the portfolio on the desk between them. Then he studied her. Not the way employers studied employees. Not the way men of his rank occasionally studied women of hers, with the calculating, dismissive sweep that filed you instantly under useful or ornamental or neither. This was different. This was the look of a man cataloging something he had been watching for a very long time and had finally decided to name. Ruth's grip on the portfolio's edge tightened. She would not look away. She had been raised in a crumbling cottage in Silver Basin by a father who had given her everything except money. Had given her Latin, the whole of his library, 3 languages, and the absolute refusal to perform smallness for anyone's comfort. And she had not survived 7 years of independent work in a world that wanted her invisible by allowing men to look at her as though she were a puzzle they had just decided to solve. She met his gaze directly. Something shifted in his expression. So faint she might have imagined it. But she did not imagine things. It was one of her better qualities. "Tell me something, Miss Bennett," Arnold said at last. "In 4 months of searching, how many women did you believe were truly suited to this life? This house? This island? This," he paused, in the way he paused before words he chose with surgical precision, "this particular arrangement?" Ruth answered without hesitation. Hesitation was a luxury she had never been able to afford. 3. 3. He repeated it without surprise. "And yet you brought me 7. You required 7 candidates, Your Grace. You were explicit on that point in our original agreement." "I was." His slate-gray eyes did not leave her face. "And the other 4? Ruth chose her words the way she chose everything. Carefully, and without apology. Hopeful. Presentable. Willing to be convinced that they wanted what you were offering." She paused. Women who would have done their best. Women who deserved better than to discover, 5 years into a marriage on a windswept island, that their best was not enough. The library was very quiet. The Atlantic hurled itself against Ethelgard sea cliffs somewhere far below them, and the fire snapped once, and the clock above the mantelpiece counted 7 beats into the silence. Arnold Harry, the 5th Duke of Ashford, the man whom the Isle of Glass called cold and the mainland called impossible and the 3 people who knew him best called simply Arnold, looked at Ruth Bennet with an expression she had no existing category for. "And the 3, he said quietly, who were genuinely suited?" Ruth held his gaze. "You crossed out all 3, Your Grace. 1st, 2nd, and 5th. He said nothing. "Lady Morrow in January," Ruth continued, because she had never been able to leave a true thing unsaid. "Mrs. Hale in February. And Miss Calloway last month, whose interview you ended after 11 minutes and whose assessment you returned to me the following morning with a single line written in your hand beneath mine." She let the pause sit between them, precise and deliberate. "You wrote," she seized too clearly. "Strike the name." The Duke was very still. "I struck it," Ruth said. "As instructed." Another silence. This one longer. This one with the particular weight of a man arriving somewhere he had been walking toward for a very long time without permitting himself to know it. Then Arnold Harry leaned forward, rested one hand flat on the closed portfolio, and said quietly, and with the absolute finality of a man making the only honest declaration he had made in 4 months, "I think, Miss Bennet, that you have been compiling the wrong list. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Hit subscribe if you are hooked in and ready to enjoy the story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story." The ink was still wet. Ruth watched it dry, that single dark line drawn through Lady Constance Fairholme's name, and understood with the cold clarity she applied to most things, that her employment was over. 4 months. 7 women. 7 lines. The portfolio in her hands was now nothing more than a record of elegant failures, and she was the woman who had curated every one of them. She should have felt relief. She had told herself on the ferry back from the mainland last Thursday with Lady Constance's acceptance letter folded in her coat pocket, that this one would be the last, that she would collect her final payment, write a letter to Mrs. Alderton confirming the contract's conclusion, and be on the Tuesday morning crossing before Arnold Harry had time to find another reason to keep her here. Instead, the Duke had not reached for his checkbook. He had not reached for anything. He simply looked at her, with those slate-gray eyes that had never once, in 4 months, looked at any of the 7 candidates the way they were looking at her now, and the room had shifted into a different kind of silence. "Your Grace," Ruth said carefully, "the terms of our agreement were 7 candidates. I have fulfilled them." She kept her voice level. She was very good at level. "Whatever your intentions going forward, my part in this arrangement is complete." Arnold said nothing. He turned the portfolio on the desk so that it faced him and opened it to the first page, where Ruth's own handwriting began, precise, unhurried, unsentimental. "Candidates for the position of Duchess of Ashford. Compiled by Miss Ruth Bennet. October, 1841. He read it as though reading it for the first time. Then he closed it. "Complete," he repeated. The word arrived flat, without agreement or argument, in the way he repeated things he intended to demantle quietly. "Yes." Ruth held her ground. She had not spent 7 years building a professional reputation on a remote Atlantic island by flinching from men who used silence as architecture. 7 candidates presented, assessed, and considered. 7 rejections made freely and without explanation. "The list is exhausted, Your Grace. The business is done." He looked at the closed portfolio. Then at the fire. Then, with the deliberate patience of a man who had already decided something and was simply choosing his moment, back at her. "The business of finding a duchess," he said quietly, "may be done, Miss Bennet." He let the pause sit between them, precise and unhurried, the way the sea sat before a storm. "The business of telling me why you struck Lady Calloway's name before I asked you to," his eyes did not leave hers, "has not yet begun." The Atlantic gales found the high windows again. The fire held. Ruth did not move. She had been wrong about Tuesday's ferry. She was not going anywhere. There had been 3 other women before Ruth. She learned this afterward from Mrs. Alderton, who told her the way she told most things, sideways between sips of tea, with the satisfied air of someone releasing information they had been holding at considerable personal cost. The first woman had heard the Duke's name and declined by post before the interview was scheduled. The second had arrived at Ethelgard's ferry dock, looked up at the house on the headland, and taken the next boat back without sending word. The third had made it as far as the library, sat down across from Arnold Harry, and lasted 4 minutes before inventing an urgent family matter that required her immediate return to the mainland. Ruth had not known any of this when she crossed the threshold of Ethelgard on that Tuesday in October. She had known only what Mrs. Alderton's letter described: a duke, a commission, a salary that would keep her father's cottage from its creditors for 2 full years, and what the Isle of Glass whispered about Arnold Harry in the particular hush that preceded his name in any conversation. Cold, exacting, impossible to read, and not a man who suffered either inefficiency or pretense. Ruth had thought, good. She had no pretense to spare. The interview lasted 12 minutes. Arnold had been standing at the library window when she was shown in, his back to the door, watching the sea the way some men watched fires, not for warmth but for something harder to name. He had not turned immediately. Ruth had stood at the room center, taken a quiet inventory of the library's considerable disorder, and waited without fidgeting, without announcing herself, without performing the small anxious gestures that rooms like this were designed to produce in women like her. When he finally turned, his slate-gray eyes moved over her once, not rudely but completely, the way a man assessed a tool he was considering trusting with precise work. "You've heard what they say about me," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, Your Grace." And Ruth met his gaze without adjustment. Reputations are compiled by people who have been given no better information. "I prefer to form my own." Something in his expression shifted. Not warmth, not quite, but the faint recalibration of a man revising an expectation downward into something more interesting. He was quiet for a moment. Then he gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit down, Miss Bennet." She sat. The terms were explained in 10 minutes with the clean precision of a man who had reduced even this, the hunting of a wife, to a series of logical steps. Ruth listened. She asked 2 questions, both practical. She did not ask the question she would spend the next 4 months slowly understanding the answer to. Why, of all the things a duke might delegate, had he chosen to delegate this one? She accepted the commission. She shook his hand. He had offered it, which surprised her, and walked back down the headland path toward Silver Basin with the contract in her portfolio and the Atlantic at her back, telling herself she had simply taken a job. She had been wrong about that too. The first name on the list had been Lady Constance Fairholme of Thorn Crossing, and Ruth had found her exactly where society always kept its most valuable women, in a drawing room performing contentment. She had traveled to all 7 of them herself. Arnold had been explicit on that point. No letters of inquiry, no intermediaries, no second-hand impressions filtered through the unreliable machinery of social gossip. Ruth would go. Ruth would observe. Ruth would return with assessments written in her small, precise hand and leave them on his desk without embellishment or editorial sentiment. She had treated it the way she treated everything, as a problem with a solution, and the solution required only the correct application of method. She crossed the Isle of Glass in the late October rains, traveling by hired coach along roads that the Atlantic made miserable and the locals made bearable, carrying her portfolio and her measuring eye into 7 parlors, 7 carefully arranged teas, 7 conversations designed to appear casual and function as examinations. She noted handwriting. She noted how each woman treated her own servants in the 30 seconds before she remembered to perform graciousness for a stranger. She noted what they reached for when silence fell, a teacup, a window, a rehearsed laugh, and what that reaching revealed about the interior life they were not showing her. Lady Constance had been polished to a high shine and hollow at the center. Lovely, willing, and quietly desperate to leave her family's house by any available door. Ruth had written in her assessment, capable of performing the role indefinitely. Will never complain. Will never thrive. Miss Avery Holt of the Eastern Cliffs had been sharper, quick-minded and direct, with a kind of dry humor that surfaced once Ruth had asked her 3rd careful question and Avery had apparently decided that pretense was more exhausting than honesty. Ruth had liked her immediately and noted this in the margin as a liability. Liking a candidate was not part of the method. Mrs. Calloway of Silver Basin, no relation, the aisle was simply small, had been the one who saw too clearly. 40 minutes of conversation, and the woman had looked at Ruth with calm, amused eyes and said, "He won't choose any of us, will he?" Not a question. A verdict delivered without malice. Ruth had written her assessment that evening with the particular discomfort of someone recording a truth they had not been asked to find. The remaining 4 blurred, in memory, into a composite of good intentions and wrong fit, women who might have made fine duchesses for different men in different houses on different islands, but who would have slowly calcified inside Ethelgard's salt-aired silences, and known it, and said nothing, because that was what women of their position had been trained to do. Ruth had brought Arnold all 7. She had believed, with the discipline of someone who refused to know things before she had evidence for them, that she was simply doing her job. The portfolio had never felt heavier than it did now, closed on his desk, with every name crossed out and his gray eyes still on her face. The library at Ethelgard kept different hours than the rest of the house. Ruth had discovered this in her 3rd week, when a particularly stubborn assessment refused to resolve itself before midnight, and she had stayed at her writing desk in the East Wing until the household settled into its nighttime quiet. She had gone to the library for a reference volume, something on the Ashford Estate's northern land holdings, relevant to Lady Constance's family connections, and had found the fire still burning and Arnold already in his chair, reading with the focused stillness of a man who did not require the company of sleep. He had not looked up. She had found her volume. She had, after a moment's calculation, sat down at the secondary table by the window rather than retreating to the East Wing, because the fire was warmer here and the light was better and she was not yet finished working. They had spent 2 hours in silence that first night. It had been, Ruth noted privately, the most productive 2 hours she had passed in the house. It did not stay silent for long. By the 2nd week of these unplanned meetings, Arnold had developed the habit of reading her assessments aloud. Not all of them, not sequentially, but specific sentences, lifted without warning from the page and placed into the room like objects he intended to examine from multiple angles. "You write here," he said one evening, not looking up from the page, "that Miss Holt possesses the rare quality of comfortable silence." He paused. "You have listed this under strengths." "It is a strength," Ruth said, without looking up from her own work. "It is a description. Whether it constitutes a strength depends entirely on what you believe a marriage requires." Ruth set down her pen. She recognized the tone, not argumentative but precise, the voice of a man who considered imprecision a form of dishonesty. A marriage requires 2 people capable of occupying the same space without exhausting each other, she said. Comfortable silence is evidence of that capacity. "Or evidence," Arnold replied, "that neither person has anything left to say." She looked at him then. He was still looking at the page. "Those are not the same condition," she said. "No," he agreed. "Which is why the distinction matters. You have assessed her comfort. You have not assessed its source." Ruth picked up her pen. She made a note in the margin of her own draft, 3 words underlined once, and did not tell him what they were. He did not ask. But she noticed, the following morning, that her assessment of Miss Holt had been returned to her desk with a single line added beneath her conclusion in Arnold's narrow, deliberate handwriting. "The silence of acceptance is not the same as the silence of understanding." "Which one do you mean?" She had sat with that question for the better part of a week. She had not yet decided whether she resented it or was grateful for it. Both, she suspected. In roughly equal measure. The Glimmer Masquerade was held every December at Thorncrossing Hall, and it was, by the Isle of Glass's modest social standards, the event against which all other events measured themselves and found themselves wanting. Ruth had not intended to attend. Her work was conducted in drawing rooms and hired coaches and the quiet hours of Ethelgard's library. Not in ballrooms strung with winter lanterns, not in the middle of a crowd wearing silk and deliberate anonymity. She was an instrument of observation, not a participant. She had been clear on this distinction from the beginning. Arnold had been equally clear that he required her there. "I need your eye," he said, in the tone he used when he considered a matter already settled. 3 of the candidates will be present. I want your assessments of how they move in a room, not how they perform in a parlor built for my inspection. Ruth had attended. She had worn her best dress, which was adequate, and a half-mask of dark blue, which was the masquerade's only concession to festivity she allowed herself, and she had stationed herself at the east edge of the ballroom with a glass of wine she did not drink and proceeded to do what she did better than almost anything else. She watched. Lady Constance moved through the room like water finding its level. Effortlessly, instinctively, always arriving at the precise social temperature required. Miss Avery Holt stood near the windows with two gentlemen who were clearly entertaining her, judging by the quality of her attention, which was the focused, slightly dangerous kind that meant she had found something genuinely worth listening to. Mrs. Calloway had not come, which Ruth noted without surprise. Arnold circulated. He did not dance, she had not expected him to, but he spoke to each candidate with the careful, unhurried attention he brought to everything, and Ruth watched the candidates receive it. Watched the small brightening that happened in Lady Constance's expression when he turned to her. Watched Avery Holt say something that produced on Arnold's face the faint recalibration she had come to recognize as the closest he came to being caught off guard. She made notes. Precise, professional, useful notes. She was very focused on the notes. It was only when Arnold leaned briefly toward Lady Constance to hear something above the orchestra, a perfectly ordinary gesture, proximity demanded by noise, that Ruth felt it. Small, sharp, and entirely unwelcome. A tightening somewhere behind her sternum that had no professional justification and no business being there at all. She looked down at her notebook. She read back the last sentence she had written. It said, "Lady Constance responds well to sustained attention." Ruth crossed it out. Rewrote it. The second version said exactly the same thing in different words, and she knew, with the cold precision she applied to inconvenient truths, that the difference between the two versions had nothing to do with Lady Constance. She did not write the third version. Some observations were better left unrecorded. The storm came in from the northwest on a Thursday, which was, Ruth would later think, exactly the kind of detail that mattered only in retrospect. She had planned to return to Silver Basin that afternoon, a brief trip to collect correspondence and check on her father's cottage, which had developed a troubling habit of admitting rain through its eastern wall. The ferry master had taken one look at the sky over the Atlantic and shaken his head with the grim authority of a man who had watched the sea long enough to know when it was finished accepting passengers. The crossing was closed. The roads back along the headland were already rivers. Ruth was, until further notice, not going anywhere. Ethelgard's housekeeper had offered her a guest room in the north wing, a proper guest room, not the small functional quarters Ruth occupied during her working visits, and Ruth had accepted with the composed practicality of a woman who had long since stopped attaching significance to circumstances she could not control. What she had not accounted for was the kitchen. The storm had detained Arnold as well, which was not unusual. He rarely left the island, but it had also sent the household staff to their families in the village before the weather closed in, which left Ethelgard, by 7 o'clock that evening, containing exactly 2 people and no one to feed them. Ruth found him in the kitchen standing before the cold range with the focused, slightly dangerous expression of a man applying reason to a problem that was not responding to reason. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she came in, set down her candle, and took over without ceremony, because the alternative was watching a Duke attempt to outweed a cast-iron stove, and she did not have the patience for it. He sat at the kitchen table. He did not offer to help, which she respected. A man who knew the limits of his competence and stayed within them was more useful than one who insisted on demonstrating otherwise. They ate at the kitchen table. Not the long mahogany expanse of the formal dining room, not the careful geometry of employer and employee arranged across a professional distance, but a kitchen table with the storm loud against the windows and 2 plates of what Ruth had assembled from the larder and a bottle of wine Arnold had produced from somewhere without comment. He poured. She ate. For a while neither of them said anything, and it was a different silence from all the others. Not the loaded quiet of the library, not the professional hush of an assessment being considered, but something simpler and more dangerous. "Your father," Arnold said eventually. "The cottage in Silver Basin. Is he well?" Ruth looked up. In 4 months, he had never asked her anything personal. She had not asked him anything personal either. It had been one of the arrangement's unspoken boundaries, and they had both observed it with the disciplined consistency of people who understood exactly why it existed. "Well enough," she said carefully. "He does not complain. That is not the same as well." She looked at him across the table. He was watching her with the direct, unhurried attention she had come to know as simply the way he looked at things he considered worth understanding. "No," she said. "It isn't." The storm pressed against the windows. The candle between them held its light. Ruth reached for her wine and told herself that this, the kitchen, the table, the question he had no professional reason to ask, was simply what happened when a storm removed all the furniture of ordinary arrangement and left two people with nothing between them but the plain fact of each other's company. She almost believed it. Ruth asked the question the following morning. Not in the kitchen, where the storm's aftermath had left the windows salt-streaked and the pretense of ordinary arrangement had been carefully reconstructed with daylight and the return of the household staff. Not in the East Wing, where her professional quarters carried the reliable weight of established distance. She asked it in the library, standing at the edge of his desk with her portfolio under her arm and the Atlantic finally quiet outside, because she had spent the night in the North Wing guest room deciding that the question had been owed for 4 months and she was finished waiting for a better moment to collect it. "I want to know," she said, without preamble, "why none of them were suitable." Arnold looked up from his correspondence. He did not look surprised. He set down his pen with the deliberate care she had come to read as preparation rather than delay. "You have your assessments," he said. "I have your rejections. Those are not the same thing." She placed the portfolio on his desk and opened it to the first page. "Lady Constance. Too polished, you said nothing. Miss Holt. Too sharp, you said nothing. Mrs. Calloway, you ended in 11 minutes and returned her file with a single line that told me more about you than it told me about her." She turned another page. "For more after that. 4 more lines. No explanations. No criteria I failed to meet. Nothing I could use to find you what you actually wanted." She looked at him directly. "So I am asking you plainly, Your Grace. What were you looking for that 7 women could not provide?" The silence that followed was the longest he had ever made her wait inside one. Then Arnold opened the top drawer of his desk and removed a notebook. Small, leather-bound, the cover worn at the corners in the way of something consulted regularly. He placed it on the desk beside her portfolio without opening it. "I have been keeping my own record," he said. Ruth looked at the notebook. Then at him. "Of the candidates. Of the assessments." His eyes did not leave hers. "Of the woman writing them. The questions she asked that I had not thought to ask. The things she noticed that 3 previous intermediaries had not thought worth noticing. The margins of her reports, where the real conclusions lived." A pause, precise and deliberate. The way she crossed out Lady Calloway's name 12 hours before I asked her to, because she had already understood something I had not yet admitted to myself. Ruth did not move. "I was not keeping a list of what I wanted in a Duchess," Arnold said quietly. He placed one hand flat on the closed notebook, the same gesture she realized as the night before. The same finality. "I was keeping a list of everything I had already found. In the wrong list. Compiled by the wrong woman for the wrong purpose." The fire held. The Atlantic held. Ruth looked at the notebook on his desk and understood, with the cold and total clarity that had always been her most reliable quality, that the audit was complete. The numbers, at last, were correct. Ruth picked up the notebook. She did not ask permission. In 4 months she had earned the right to handle evidence without ceremony. And this, whatever it was evidence. She opened it to the first page and read the date at the top in Arnold's narrow, deliberate hand. The 4th of October. Her first day at Ethelgard. The day she had stood in this library and told him she preferred to form her own opinions about a man's reputation rather than inherit someone else's. He had been writing about her since the first day. She turned the pages slowly. They were not love letters. She would have been more comfortable if they were, because love letters she would have known how to refuse. They were something more difficult than that. Observations. Precise, unsentimental, accumulated with the same methodical discipline she applied to her own work. The way she had reorganized the East Wing correspondence without being asked. The questions she put to candidates that revealed, in their answers, not who the women were performing but who they actually were. A note from the night of the Glimmer masquerade, one line only: she did not watch the dancing. She watched the room. She is the only person here who sees it the way I do. Ruth closed the notebook. She set it down with the careful steadiness of someone handling something that had more weight than its size suggested. You could have told me, she said. Her voice was level. She was very good at level, even when level cost her something. No, Arnold said. I couldn't. Why? He stood then, which he rarely did when making a point. He was a man who understood that stillness carried its own authority, and came around the desk until he was standing before her with no professional geometry between them. No mahogany. No portfolio. No list. Because you would have left, he said simply. The moment you understood what I was doing, you would have closed the portfolio, returned my fee, and been on the Tuesday crossing before I had finished the sentence. You are the most professionally principled person I have ever employed, Ruth, and it would have been the correct thing to do. The gray eyes held hers without flinching. I was not ready for the correct thing. She looked at him. At this man the Isle called impossible and the mainland called cold and the three people who knew him called simply Arnold, and she understood, with the clarity that had always arrived in her like weather, sudden and total and impossible to argue with, that he was neither of those things. He was a man who had built his distances carefully and kept them faithfully and had spent 4 months watching someone walk through every one of them without appearing to try. He reached into the portfolio. He turned to the last page, where 7 names sat beneath 7 dark lines, and beneath them all, in fresh ink, he had written an 8th. Her name. Simply that. No title, no family connection, no column of qualifying attributes. Just, Ruth Bennett. October 1841. Present. You are not the woman I hired to find, Arnold said quietly. You are the reason every other name was wrong. The list was framed eventually, which had been Arnold's idea and which Ruth had found either deeply romantic or mildly absurd depending on her mood and the quality of the morning light. It hung in the library, not the study. She had insisted on the library, because the study was where business was conducted and this, she maintained, was not business. A simple frame of dark oak, the portfolio's final page mounted behind glass, 7 names each wearing its single dark line, and beneath them all her own name in fresh ink, unlined, unqualified, permanent. Visitors who noticed it sometimes asked. Arnold told them it was a record of 7 excellent women who had deserved better than his consideration. Ruth told them it was a reminder that the correct answer had been in the room the entire time. Both versions were true. They had long since stopped finding this remarkable. Ethelgard in the years that followed became, by degrees, a different house. Not loudly. Ruth had never trusted loud transformations, which tended to announce themselves precisely as they began to fail. The change was the quiet kind, the kind that accumulated in small daily decisions the way the sea accumulated at a cliff face, and one morning you looked up and understood that the shape of things had altered permanently and the alteration had been going on for longer than you had noticed. The East Wing correspondence, which Ruth had reorganized in her first month of employment, remained organized. The library kept its late hours. The kitchen table, which had survived the December storm and one subsequent conversation about her father's roof, Arnold had sent a carpenter to Silver Basin in January without mentioning it until the work was done, became the place where most of the house's real decisions were made, in the unhurried way of 2 people who had stopped performing efficiency for each other and started simply living it. Her father visited in the spring and stayed 3 weeks, which was 2 weeks longer than planned, because Arnold had asked him to stay and her father, who had spent 30 years building a library and 1 daughter and considered both his finest achievements, had looked at the Duke of Ashford across the kitchen table and said yes before Ruth had finished her tea. She ran the charitable foundation for the Isle's working women from the library desk, the secondary one by the window, which had accumulated over time the particular organized disorder of a workspace genuinely in use. Arnold ran the estates from his own desk across the room. They argued regularly about philosophy and method and the correct interpretation of evidence, and the arguments were the best conversations Ruth had ever had, and she had been having good conversations her entire life. On clear evenings they walked the headland path above the Atlantic, where the Isle of Glass caught the last light and held it briefly, the way it had on her very first crossing, before the dark came in from the west and the sea went silver and the house behind them glowed against the sky. She had stood on the ferry dock 4 years ago and looked up at Ethelgard and given herself 30 seconds before she walked toward it. She had never once, in all the time since, considered walking away. The ink on the 8th name never faded. Not in the way of things written in haste or hope or the fragile optimism of people who want something to be true. It stayed because it had been written by a man who chose his words the way he chose everything. Deliberately, without revision, and only when he was certain. Ruth Bennett had arrived at Ethelgard carrying a leather portfolio and the professional composure of a woman who had learned to make herself useful in a world that had not been designed with her in mind. She had come to find a Duchess. She had compiled her lists, crossed her distances, made her careful notes in small unhurried handwriting, and delivered 7 names to a man who had crossed out every single one. She had not expected to be the answer. She had not, if she was honest, and Ruth was always honest, even when it cost her, permitted herself to know that she was looking for one. But that was the thing about the right company. It did not announce itself. It accumulated, the way the sea accumulated at a cliff face, the way light accumulated on the Isle of Glass at the end of a clear evening, quietly and then all at once and then permanently. The list hung in the library. The kitchen table held its hours. The Atlantic kept its old, indifferent counsel outside the high windows of Ethelgard, and inside 2 people who had found in each other the rarest of things. Someone worth arguing with, worth sitting in silence with, worth building an entire life at the edge of the sea with, went on living it. The 7th name had been crossed out in silence. The 8th had been written in certainty. And that, in the end, was the only list that mattered. And that is where we leave Ruth and Arnold. At the edge of the sea, in the library they made their own, with a framed list of 7 crossed-out names and a life that no portfolio could have predicted. If this story found you, moved you, or kept you watching past your bedtime, you are exactly the kind we made it for. Please give this video a like. It tells us the story landed the way it was meant to. Subscribe so you never miss the next one because there are more rooms, more lists, and more people who find each other in the margins of the wrong assignment. And hit that notification bell, because the next story begins without warning, the way all the best ones do.